Alright everybody, and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at another one of the new weapons added to episode Heresy. This time it's going to be the Arc Trace Rifle Warlord Spear, which is currently dropping from Iron Banner. We'll go over how to get it, as well as the trait combinations that I think are the best on this weapon, and yeah. If you like this video or find it helpful, as always, best way to support me is a like or a subscribe. Comment down below if there's anything particular that you like on this weapon, and yeah. Thank you. I don't want to waste any more of your time. Let's go ahead and get started. So Warlord Spear is dropping from Iron Banner, but to go about getting it, you have one of two options. One, you can play Iron Banner till you get it to randomly drop, at which point it will be available for focusing and Lord Saladin's focusing pool, or you can get to rank 4 with Lord Saladin and claim the static role that he's giving away. Currently, the roll on this is not particularly great, so you could get this and then just start focusing, but if you played last season in episode Revenant, you might not want to do that, because if you remember, Tenacious Mastery, the rocket stasis sidearm with chill clip, was one of the weapons that Saladin was giving away at rank 4, and in the last week of the last Iron Banner of the season, he gave away the God roll. So if you get an early drop of Warlord Spear, it may be worth saving that reward for later in the season so that you can then pick it up at a later date if he offers one of the rolls that you're unable to get through random farming, but it's up to you. I ended up claiming mine and then just using focusing to farm for the rolls that I used in this video, but either way works. It just may be something to think about if you don't want to farm Iron Banner endlessly and then realize later down the line that you can't get a very good roll that he's essentially giving away for free. And for this weapon, it's got some unique perks, I'm not gonna lie. It and the other trace rifle that released, which is Unsworn from the new Sundered Doctrine dungeon, are both very, very good in terms of the actual traits that they're rolling with. And usually I would start with the third column traits, but here we're going to start with the fourth, because I think that's really what makes Warlord Spear unique compared to other trace rifles in the game, because there are two perks that really pull ahead of the others. The other perks in that column, as you'll see here on your screen, are pretty good, but the two that I really want to highlight are Detonator Beam, which is a new perk, and Jolting Feedback, which is not new, but this is the first time it has ever appeared on a trace rifle. Starting with Detonator Beam, this perk is also on Unsworn, which is the trace rifle from Sundered Doctrine, and it's pretty solid. It's just keep the beam on a target long enough and you'll get an explosion. I feel like you can proc this pretty consistently more than once per magazine. On Unsworn, it felt like I was getting it 2 or 3 times a mag, depending on whether my rewind rounds kicked in or not. It's very, very good. It does a nice chunk of damage, but as far as like actual utility goes, it's not anything super crazy, so I'm not going to give it too much time here, but it is very good, and I highly recommend picking up a Warlord Spear as well with Detonator Beam. The vastly more interesting perk of the two, however, I think is actually going to be Jolting Feedback. I think this is the best fourth column perk for this weapon because it's unique. You can't get anything exactly like this currently in the game, and Jolting Feedback has been pretty good on the weapons we've seen it on so far. It was very, very good on the Pyroelectric Repellent, which was the auto rifle from the Vesper's Host dungeon. And the big thing is it makes it pretty similar to the old Path of Least Resistance trace rifle from Season of the Seraph, the one where you would slap on Volt Shot and then use it to jolt a target and use that to essentially zap everything around it. The other thing that Jolting Feedback does, though, is unlike Volt Shot, it gives this weapon effectively permanent overload, as Jolting Feedback just requires consistent damage. It does not require a kill into a reload into the jolt. It just requires consistent damage and then it'll jolt the target, which, like I said, does give this weapon effectively permanent on-command overload, but the other thing that it gives that isn't necessarily apparent immediately is very high ammo economy. And what I mean by this is that trace rifles currently are very, very single target focused weapons. However, Jolting Feedback will essentially let you just jolt a target and use them like a Tesla coil to just burn everything around them. You can put the beam on a big target, get that jolt, and then let the damage coming off the jolted target zap everything around it. This will give you some multi-target damage options that trace rifles tend to lack, and Detonator Beam can do this too, since it is an area of effect explosion, but it doesn't synergize with anything specifically, whereas Jolt does synergize with Overload and your Arc subclasses. I also think trace rifles are just one of the best weapon types in the game to put Jolting Feedback on, since they have the highest fire rate at 1000 RPM, and that beam can jolt very, very quickly, and you can get a lot of extra damage out with the Chain Lightning. It is super good. I highly recommend farming for both roles, though, as Detonator Beam is still very, very good, and in a season where we have something like Overload Trace Rifle on our artifact, I think Detonator Beam will be better, since you won't need to use Jolting Feedback to get that Overload function. but both are super good, and I genuinely believe both are very, very, very much worth getting. So go for both if you can. I know farming Iron Banner is not always the most fun thing in the world, but this is going to be worth it, I promise. Before we move on to the other perks, Column 4 does also have things like Killing Tally or Target Lock. I didn't go very in-depth on those here because those have been on a bunch of trace rifles at this point. There's not really anything new to say, but if you want something a little more standard, Killing Tally, Target Lock, just take your pick. Whichever one you think you'll get more use out of if you want a more standard damage perk. Now to shift focus to our third column, and now we're going to go work backwards here to the third column because I think it's important to look at how these perks pair with Detonator Beam or Jolting Feedback, which are far and away the more interesting options here. Some of these are going to be pretty conventional, things like rewind rounds. Some of them not so conventional, like maybe even high impact reserves. So we'll start with high impact reserves because it's something that I think is actually worth thinking about on this weapon. High impact reserve struggles from the fact that it's an old perk that doesn't see very much use anymore. Technically, it's really a perk from Destiny 1. It's really just a renamed version of Glass Half Full from Destiny 1. And as a result, as like a lot of old perks in Destiny, it's been power crept a bit, but in this case, it comes on Column 3 with another damage perk available in Column 4. And I don't think it's doing anything mind-blowing, but free damage is free damage. I think it's a very good one to pair with Detonator Beam specifically, because some of that bonus damage can actually add up as you stack more and more sources. It's not necessarily the greatest thing, but I do think it is at the very least worth mentioning here. And then Rewind Rounds is the next perk, and in my opinion, the best general use option for Column 3 here, just because it ends up making your time between reloads a bit longer, which uptime is always good. Nothing fancy, it's also very good with Detonator Beam, as you can keep the beam on target much longer to get your kills, but then it's also very good with Jolting Feedback, Killing Tally, or Target Lock. Any of those are good if you want to use a more standard perk. Rewind Rounds is the best thing if you're not quite sure what you want. Honorable mention to Envious Assassin too, because it fills a similar niche as Rewind Rounds, making your time between reloads longer. But I feel like Envious Assassin has lost a fair amount of its appeal after the changes it got, where if anything in your loadout changes at all, you lose your stacked magazine. Given how often players like to swap boots around for surges and such, the uptime on the perk may feel a little low, especially if you're somebody who is swapping your loadouts a lot to maximize use of different mods. It's not the worst thing in the world. I've fallen kind of low on Envious Assassin in recent seasons ever since that change came through. The last Column 3 perk I'm going to talk about today, though, is Loose Change, which is a perk that traditionally I am not the biggest fan of because a lot of the things that you have to drop to proc it do not come to you and you have to go get them on your own. But in this case, I think it's actually really good because they work with Ionic Traces. And Ionic Traces are going to be really good because they come to you, especially when you're pairing it with the Jolting Feedback and an arc-focused build. The build I'm specifically thinking of here is the new Geomag's Warlock, especially in a case where you need to swap out Delicate Tomb for a different exotic, like in a raid or a dungeon where you may want something like Queenbreaker. Loose Change just makes the gun play a lot smoother. A lot of the penalty movements that it has is very nice. The reload speed is nice. And since you're going to be making a ton of Ionic Traces anyway, which will come to you instead of you needing to collect them, like I mentioned before, it's a very solid choice for Ionic Trace-centric loadouts. I think for encounters where you don't want to commit your exotic slot to something like DPS with like Queenbreaker or something like Anarchy for the lock set, if you wanted to use that, I think it is really good since, you can swap out Delicate Tomb, although I think in activities where you don't really care about using a specific exotic weapon, Delicate Tomb does still outperform this weapon, but it does give you flexibility, and that is something I think is very, very, very valuable about it. I'll talk a little bit more about how I think it fits well in its loadouts and activities later, but I just wanted to mention that here since this perk specifically interacts very, very well with that build. And the last thing that I want to mention before moving on to like some of the loadout section of this video is the Origin perk, which is Skulking Wolf. A lot of times, the Origin perk is either not super important, minimally important, or whatever, and I actually think Skulking Wolf falls into that category, but I do want to mention it, specifically because it now has an effect in PvE, whereas previously using an Iron Banner weapon in PvE pretty much meant running without an Origin trait, as Skulking Wolf was basically always the only Origin trait they came with, and it didn't do anything in PvE. That is no longer the case, as now when you're low on health, PvE kills will also make enemies less accurate when targeting you. It's not super crazy, but at least it does something for PvE now, and I believe this is the only Origin trait that makes enemies less accurate, although I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is one of the only ones that does that. And all of that brings me to loadouts. How do you build a loadout around the weapon? Because a lot of times you can have a really good weapon that just doesn't fit any good loadout, and so it kind of struggles. Well, the good news is I actually think Warlord Spear fits a lot of different loadouts. I think it's super solid and super versatile with a good variety of perks. For things like high-end Nightfalls, GMs, it's pretty much a permanent overload on demand with Jolting Feedback, which is awesome. I think that is a really, really useful thing for this to have, and both of its better damage perks add multi-target damage that trace rifles generally lack too. If we see a trace rifle season in the future where our artifact has a lot of mods that interact with trace rifles or something like that, I think this will be one of the top options alongside Unsworn from Sundered Doctrine. I will almost certainly be running this trace in a lot of the GMs this season that require overload champions, just because it does feel like a very, very easy solution to slot in. Rated dungeon content is where I start to struggle to find a more specific slot for it. Like, it's still really good, don't get me wrong. It's just that a lot of times trace rifle warlocks will be using Cenotaph Mask, and that's the vast majority of trace rifles you see, and they're almost always also using Divinity in their energy slot. There are some cases where I see them not doing it, but a lot of times they are running Divinity. And so I do see it having some power in the Arc Warlock builds, like without Cenotaph and with Geomags, as most DPS phases are actually being done with Queenbreaker currently as the standard, like, easy LFG, sit in one place and mag dump, like, DPS option. And in that case, you may want to replace Delicate Tomb as your Ionic Trace making special weapon, and Warlord Spear is a really good choice for that. In my opinion, it's probably the best one outside something like maybe a Volt Shot Indebted Kindness. And it's also very double special friendly, as traces are still very good in double special loadouts. And the big thing is they did get a 20% damage buff versus minor tier enemies this episode, and their big competitor, which is Rocket Sidearms, and especially in this weapon's case, which would be Indebted Kindness with Volt Shot, got a pretty big nerf to their overall damage output. And so I think it's a really good choice, even though I don't think it's as, you know, grab and go in a raid as it necessarily is in like a Nightfall. Just because in Nightfall you have the champions to deal with, you have big targets to deal with where the Jolt is really good for clearing out the smaller guys, and the weapon just has very good ammo efficiency. It's going to be very, very, very good, but I don't know how much I will use it in raids and dungeons unless I'm on my Warlock doing Arc and I need a specific exotic for damage. As a whole, though, I do think Warlord Spear is probably the best trace rifle in the energy slot now, discounting exotics, of course. And I think it's really good. I think it's worth farming Iron Banner for. If you want to farm some Iron Banner, then go for it. It's going to be one of the better trace rifles you could get, and especially in the future if we get a trace rifle-centric season, this probably will be glued to my loadouts. Well, that is all I have for today, so if you liked the video or found it helpful, like, subscribe, all that is the best way to support my channel. Drop a comment, let me know if you enjoyed it, didn't enjoy it. Cool. We're trying to get back to making more consistent videos. One of our next videos this week might still be based on a trace rifle. It might be Unsworn this time around, because I think it also is a very good trace rifle for a few different reasons than Warlord Spear, but yeah, we'll get around to it when we get a chance. So I will see you guys in the next one. I will not keep you any longer. Thank you for watching this far if you've made it, and I will see you guys next time. Later.